Director of Represent Theatre, and I'm joined this evening by Laura Solomons and Sorel Madzia. Laura is Head of Donor Relations at the Sutton Trust and also Chair of Trustees at the Peter Minute Trust. Thanks for joining us, Laura. And Sorel, who you've just witnessed, plays Angela Gnoni, who is the CEO of our fictional charity in the play. Thanks, Sorel, for staying on with us. Now, this is the second of our talkbacks, and this evening we're going to talk a little bit about corporate philanthropy and the ethics of that. Now, we have some talking points we're going to discuss, but we'd love to hear your questions as well. So please put those in the chat function, and we'll answer as many of them as we can in the next half hour or so. So, certainly a lot of food for thought in the play, isn't there, I think? We're just going to focus on one area this evening, though. So I think what we just witnessed there was how a central theme of the play is the ethics of corporate philanthropy, where donations come from, how they're funded, and also whether a charity needs to think about that before they accept a donation. So Laura, you have an interesting insight to both the charity and a donor perspective. I wonder, which hat did you have on when you were watching the play, and what informed your vote?
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for having me along. Please excuse me if you do hear some barking. We've got a new puppy, and she likes to bark at all the wrong times, so please forgive me for that. I was really privileged to see the play last week, and I must say it's been sort of playing on my mind ever since. I've had lots of debates and conversations with people about it. The first thing I'd say is it felt so real. I don't know how you did it, but this past year, kind of going into lots of different kind of charity spaces, trustee spaces, it really did kind of capture the complexity and the dynamics of a real trustee meeting, and the different perspectives that people are coming to it with. The first hat I definitely had on quite firmly was the charity perspective, and I very much kind of felt the pain of having to make that very difficult decision, and was just thinking, actually, we've encountered similar situations at different organisations I've worked for, maybe not to that sort of same extent, but if somebody does offer you a very large donation, just understanding what processes you go through to make those decisions as to what you should or shouldn't do with it. Even more commonly, being offered money to do things that maybe are sort of on the fringes of your mission, or that you wouldn't have chosen to spend it on if you were to fundraise for that. But then I was thinking a little bit more, and the kind of funder hat came in. And I guess one of the things that's been particularly dominant in the funding world over the past year and a half is really around the unintended challenges we as funders bring. And that's in a whole bunch of different places, one being about the power dynamic, and how can someone say no to you if you're offering them money, but also in other ways, something that's been really interesting is thinking about responsible investing. And actually, even this morning, as Chair of Trustees, we were listening to different investors. Where do you put £5 million? Do you completely divest from fossil fuel companies, or do you have a stake in the game and try and influence and change the conversations they're having? So both hats were worn, and I just want to say a huge thank you again for all of your hard work. It was a really, really incredible thing to watch.
Oh, thank you. Crikey, I think we've thrown even more questions in there, haven't we? There are no easy answers to this. I think we could argue both sides, but yeah, that's insightful. Thank you. I'm glad it struck a chord and seemed relevant to you. Can I just add one more question before I ask Sorel something? Do you think that this dilemma that we portray in the play, is that a common one that charities do face, or in your experience, is it quite rare that they would have that sort of scenario?
It's an overblown version of it. So to have a sort of £1 million offer completely out of the blue from one of the very worst offenders in the sort of climate crisis is the scenario taken to its furthest extent. But having donations being offered in different places and deciding what to accept and what not, and what decisions you make in order to accept or refuse donations. It's a very challenging thing to refuse a donation. There was an interesting example of kind of with Bitcoin and blockchain and lack of transparency of banking. If you were to be, somebody were to transfer you a large donation, you don't even know how to give that back. Where it came from. Is that money just okay to be spent? I've got some thoughts, but I'll hold back as to sort of how you make those decisions.
Later. All right, thank you. So if I could just move to you, Sorrel. As Angela, you remind us that a trustee has a responsibility to act in the best interest of a charity, kind of irrespective of their personal views. So Angela, we know, is passionate and hugely enthusiastic about developing the work of the charity she set up with her late father. My question to you is, do you think that her judgment is overshadowed by sentiment, or do you feel like she makes some sort of fair and realistic argument for accepting the donation?
First of all, hi, thank you for having me. It's a really interesting question. I think when I first got the character of Angela, that was something that we looked into and you kind of delve in to see. And what I think has happened is she's kind of at a crossroads and she has to make a really hard decision because it's been a tough year. We've had a pandemic, loads of donations have just stopped coming through. And she's kind of given this pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, and she can see what she can do with that money. I think her emotional blackmail is only coming through because of the stakes of where the charity is at the moment. However, I think if this money had been offered a year and a half ago, she would still absolutely be up for taking it and be giving factual reasons, but I think the emotional side wouldn't be as heavy because her fear is losing the charity. And at the moment, that's a very real thing. But a year and a half ago, they had money to carry on doing, the great work they were doing. So I think it's kind of at this current moment, she doesn't see any other way and she's gonna kind of do whatever it takes to get it. And
like the survival instinct.
Yeah.
If she had lost the charity, what would she have gone on to do next, do you think?
Oh, I think she would have moped for a little bit. And kind of been upset with herself, but she comes from just knowing how to lift something up from the bottom. She would have gone back into doing work with the community. I don't know if she would have set up a charity again necessarily, but I don't see her doing anything else. I think her dad has been such a huge influence in her life, and the idea of giving back is so big to her that she would have carried on helping, but maybe not she would have done it in a way where no one can say no to her, basically. Learned her lesson.
Actually, I found in my working experience that, and private life as well, that the people who run charities the best are the ones you just cannot say no to. And they do it in the politest way and the nicest way, but there's something in their core that you just know you have to do what they say and you have to support their work because they're just very good at convincing you. So I think you're right. She's one of those characters. Well, Laura, one of the things that Angela highlights in her arguments is the impracticality of screening all the donors, and also the fact that some donations are anonymous, or like you said, maybe via Bitcoin. So do you think charities have a responsibility to monitor and to screen their donors?
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting, the dynamic that you had with trustees and then with a sort of paid member of staff who wouldn't actually get that kind of stake in the final decision. Just so there's a few different lenses to look at this through. So the first is your kind of legal and regulatory duty, which is, as was very rightly pointed out, to act in the best interest of the charity, but that can mean a whole range of different things. Most charitable organisations would need to set up a due diligence process. And it's not necessarily that every pound that comes into the organisation needs to be thoroughly investigated in the same way, but it's really thinking about, will accepting this donation stop us achieving our mission? So really I voted not to accept the funds if people are interested.
Oh.
And the thing for me was around the size of the donation. It would have been likely to receive a lot of publicity, be likely that the sort of expectations attached to that donation would be such that it would overshine the work, and it might be that the sort of risk around the reputation would come back. But you'd have a risk register, and you'd go through quite thoroughly and say, look at the sort of pros and cons, as was done, but it was perhaps done a little bit more emotively than it might be done in a sort of trustee meeting, as it were. And then you also need to think about the questions that you're asking. So we do live in a capitalist society. We do live in a society that has certain structures, and you need to think about within our organisation, what are we trying to achieve? There are some really meaningful partnerships with organisations that on the face of it may be viewed in one way as not charitable or not doing good things, but if you can work with them to make them better. So for example, lots of kind of health charities have lots of regulations around working with certain food and drink companies, and actually, is it that if you work with them, you can reduce the sugar content that then feeds into certain health issues? So there might be ways of working together, but that didn't seem to be the dynamic of this offer. It seemed very much sort of kind of top down, here's my donation. Whereas I'd say that if it was more of a negotiation on the sort of on the charity professional level, if you can justify that negotiation and the boundaries that you've put in place around a donation, that might help you. Whereas on the trustee level, you're very much looking at sort of, does this meet certain criteria that we've set out around a sort of ethical due diligence process? And I hope someone was taking notes in your play, because if anyone came and asked you for the audit trail of how you made that decision, you'd need to be able to justify that and prove why you came to that conclusion.
So there's actually a lot more to it than we think. It's not just pulling at the heartstrings. I've actually had one of our charity supporters from my other job who watched the play came back and said, actually, we've had a very similar situation and I've had to delve deeper into this. And it's actually quite technically difficult to refuse a donation. And as you were saying earlier, we have to prove that it's going to inhibit our ability to pursue our mission, etc. So, whilst it's great to see the emotional tuggle that the trustees have, there's actually in real life a few issues and a few hurdles they'd need to jump.
You might direct it elsewhere is a more tactically sensitive way of doing it. So you might say, actually, have you thought about working with this organisation that
pass it on,
not just to pass on the problem, but actually thinking about a better fit for them. And we will do that. If there's a conflict of interest, sometimes it can help to make introductions elsewhere. And I asked the question about where your character Angela would have gone on, because I just wanted to make the point again that organizations are made up of people, often very talented, very incredible people, and they can do really important work elsewhere. You don't need a charity name and brand to be able to deliver incredible work. So I agree. I think your character would have gone on to do amazing things no matter what.
Great. The play raises ethical and environmental questions which the audience are forced to address when they're asked to vote for the outcome. So Val, I'd like to ask you, what role do you think the theatre plays in kind of presenting these more controversial topics as opposed to, say, mainstream news or documentaries?
I mean, I think the theatre plays a huge part in tackling issues like this and talking about the uncomfortable stuff that people don't necessarily always want to talk about, because it's not easy, hearing about fast fashion or about Amazon Prime or about, all of those things. But when it's done in a way that does make you look at yourself, but you're also enjoying yourself in this hour and 15 minutes, or you've even if you go to the theatre, you are on the drive back, you're talking about the themes that have been brought up. I think theatre has a very niche way of bringing up topics and issues for people to discuss without preaching or without feeling like you're being judged. It's a very safe space for all these things, and everyone's opinions gets heard. Like, I feel like especially in this play, we saw a variety of, you know, broad spectrum opinions on a really difficult topic, and I think someone can resonate with one opinion or another and say, oh, actually I kind of hear what they're saying. So yeah, I think theatre does play a massive role, and it shows even throughout history. Like, theatre and arts in general just take up these things that sometimes are really tough discussions to have, and spin it in a way that we can sit and listen and learn, and then go home and do a bit of research or go and talk about it and spread the message. But it's done in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming and like, yeah, the world's going to end, but oh, okay, I can make a change in a small way, you know. But yeah, I think theatre does play a massive part.
I'd love more theatre and less webinars on
Yeah,
topics like this.
please.
Yeah,
Refreshing Zoom call for change. I think what sort of backs up what you were saying as well is what's been really interesting is the variety of outcomes we've had in the last couple of weeks, or last 3 weeks, I should say, because I don't know if everybody realizes in the audience, but it's not rigged. We don't rig the outcome. It's a genuine poll, and we've had different responses every performance, haven't we? Which has been really interesting to see, sort of take the pulse of the nation, if you like, to see where people are. So I think that's been quite insightful for us as well.
I'm amazed, because for me it's so clear cut that it's a no.
I never thought there'd be a tie, but we've had a few ties, haven't we, already?
we've had a few yeses, and I think somebody was pointing out that obviously there's different breakout rooms, so depending on what room you go to, different revelations come out, which then also help you make your decision along the way. So yeah, it's been kind of strange. We've been trying to figure out, like, if it's a bigger audience, do we get a yes? If it's a small, like, we've been trying to figure out all the tricks, but we haven't yet got it. So
I say I'm guilty of always voting yes, because I like the ending. I think it's more powerful, even though morally I feel a bit bad for that, but there we go. All right, I have one final question for both of you, and that is, we just said there are 3 possible outcomes: accept the money, reject it, or a tie. In the event that they decide to reject the money, Flo observes, but the money still exists. We haven't stopped them burning down the rainforest. My question is it enough to just reject controversial donations to make a stand, or are simultaneous proactive measures also required? Do you have any thoughts on that? Excuse me. Laura?
Yeah, I'm happy to give that one a go. I think it's about understanding your sphere of influence and your power. And so there are people out there who have the power to hold organisations like this to account, and there's lots of different tactics to do it. And as I was saying earlier, a really interesting tactic is around responsible investing. So the funding sector give out 6 billion to charities in terms of donations that they can spend on their charitable work, but invest 60 billion. So if you think about actually the extent of the difference that can be made in terms of where that power sits, and if we speak with a kind of shareholder voice, you can really make a difference in voting down kind of really high remuneration packages and refusing to support organisations that don't have meaningful diversity at leadership and all those sorts of things. But I don't think that's the responsibility of grassroots Black and minority ethnic-led charities working on the ground. I think they should be given unrestricted multi-year funding and being able to get on with the really important work they're doing. There's also something, if people are interested in the kind of different nature of funding, this idea of sort of giving a check and walking away is being challenged in lots of spaces. There's something called participatory grant making, which is nothing about us without us. And it's a really exciting trend that we're seeing in the funding sector, which is actually that the people spending the money have the say in how it's spent within their community. So rather than sort of having, it's really sad that we're sort of having to have conversations about, here's this big powerful entity, do we take this money or not? I'd much rather us move to a place where we're having conversations about, here's a big pot of money, how can the people who know how best to spend it be meaningfully part of those conversations about spending it. So here's £1 million. What would you do with it? How would you make a difference? How would you work collaboratively with others in the community to lift people up, as I believe the charity kind of mission was? I'm just going to try and summarize. So I think no, you don't just leave the money there, but also let people with privilege do that hard work and emotional labour. And it's not the responsibility necessarily of amazing organisations doing work on the ground to try and do that and hold powerful people to account at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So interesting. I think that idea of having these people who donate massive amounts of money actually have a say or show us that you're interested in what don't just give, because sometimes giving feels a bit empty. It's almost like we've ticked that off the list, okay, on to the next thing. I think, oh gosh, the hard thing for me is, obviously I don't come from the charity sector. I wouldn't want to have the job that Angela has, because she has to make a lot of hard decisions. And yeah, when I was doing the research, initially it was like, take the money, of course, you've got to take the money. And then the more you look into it, you're like, this is difficult, because if we do take the money, yes, we're making a huge difference. But if we don't, like Flo said, all this stuff is still going to carry on happening. And, you know, what do you do in that situation? I have no clue. But as Sorel, I do think that maybe not necessarily the smaller grassroots charities, but like you're saying, if you've got the influence, if you've got the power, if you are able to have a voice and be heard, absolutely use it to hold these corporations accountable, because a lot of these smaller charities are already overloaded with a lot of work, and they're doing the best they can with the resources that they have. To then take on that mission, which is a huge mission, to take on these big entities to hold them accountable, I think can be quite hard. But I think, yeah, like you said, if you have the power and you can, absolutely you should be doing something with that. But yeah, I am not envious of anyone.
It is great, and we'll raise you £1 million another way.
Yeah.
But there is something about what you were saying about negotiating those partnerships. So and we're not talking about sort of the really awful examples here, but there are great people that want to do good. That, I don't know if you've heard the phrases kind of professional experience and lived experience. You get a lot of people get to sort of high earning, high influence positions, because they have a certain type of professional experience or perspective that can bring some value, but often they miss the value of kind of lived experience of what it will actually make a difference. So having that occur in dialogue can be really beneficial. I'll just give a little example from the Sutton Trust, which is sort of my day job, is that you have young people wanting to enter hard to access professions. So you can give them the skills and opportunities to get there, but you can also work and advocate with the organisations to take away those barriers. So it's not just about saying to a young person, you need to build up your commercial acumen, whatever that means, but also saying to organisations, well, what do you mean by talent? Is it just grades? Because can you look at that contextually? So you can ask those questions, but you need to have a certain level of kind of privilege in whatever way to be able to be in the room having the conversation. I think there's a lot of work to do to change that. I was pleased at how diverse your trustee board was, for example, in terms of skills and perspectives, but also visible diversity. That's not the case in lots of different boards, and that will lead to kind of richer, better conversations when you're met with dilemmas such as this. Hopefully not such a huge dilemma.
But Laura, that's something that you and I have certainly witnessed, isn't it, over the last year? One of the positive things I think that's come out of the pandemic is really shining a light on funders and the third sector and how we give. And like you said at the beginning, that power dynamic, we're really looking at shifting that now and saying, hang on, there isn't a hierarchy here. Funders should be listening way more to the organisations they support, really asking them a lot more about, or giving them a lot more control over it, and letting them, like you say, lead those conversations and say where the money is best spent, because they know, they're on the ground. So we're certainly seeing, hopefully, some shifts on that front, I hope, and sort of more unrestricted funding as well. So I hope that's a lasting legacy.
We definitely are. But then you've got the corporate kind of funding, which is still, I guess, that one of the things I was really interested in, what that £1 million, what would reporting against that £1 million look like? What were they expecting? Were they just giving £1 million and walking away? Or, you know, it would be interesting to see what the kind of contract or gift agreement around that would look like.
Well, exactly.
This is
unlikely to be unrestricted, I think. There definitely would come with some conditions. With some conditions, I think. But
you need to read the fine print of these sorts of deals.
And we have had a question come in which says, I think it's probably one for Laura, I think. It says, most charities would have an ethical policy agreed to call on to help decide whether to accept a substantial donation. How do you think this should be arrived at?
Yeah, so hopefully most would have. Not all do have, but most do have, and it's usually decided at the kind of trustee level, and you usually ask a set of questions for the organisation. It's a really interesting question, which how should you get there? I think there should be more dialogue and conversation with people that work for the charity, but also the communities in which the charity exists to kind of work with and benefit. So it shouldn't be such a top-down decision, but often it is. The other thing is, these are often quite time pressure. You can have sort of, you know, years to come up with your ethical policy, but when something like this comes in, often it's quite a quick turnaround time in terms of actually applying it to that set of questions. I mean, often ethical policies look at reputation. So really it's around, you know, would accepting this donation put our organisation in such a light that we wouldn't be able to carry out our charitable mission, and what will kind of sway the balance. Don't know if you've seen, there's been some really interesting campaigning around stopping arts organisation accepting funding from BP.
We were talking about this just today as a company,
and that's been working. So there, you know, there are, I guess, when we talk about what we can do, we can also do some work to try and shift the balance, because it's around what the public collective attitude is to kind of acceptable and unacceptable working practices. So, you know, if people think that accepting a donation will be a distraction from their work, they won't accept it. And then that organisation, they want to give away their money. If they're knocking on doors and finding that everyone's saying no, they're going to have a kind of long, hard look at themselves and think about doing things differently. So maybe if I can't convince you all to vote no, maybe do it because it might actually get that organised. I don't think it would change what they're doing, but you know, actually
raise awareness, I suppose.
Yeah, saying no can be really powerful. And thinking about when and how to do it. But yeah, how, it's usually just a set of questions that you ask yourself, and unfortunately it's not a kind of one rule fits all kind of thing, because every charitable mission will be different. And actually, for example, some might do policy and campaigning work that means that, you know, they want to be more neutral in a space, whereas others are quite happy to influence through partnership. And if there's donation attached to that, well, that means that someone's kind of got skin in the game, as it were, because they're really investing in making that difference. So it's got to be a conversation each time.
You need thick skin in this job, don't you? And a lot of patience. Oh, thank you both so much for giving your time for this. It's really interesting to hear your insight both into the character and the world that you work in. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone found that insightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.